We're going to get started. I'm Bob Costa with the Washington Post. We're joined by Jonathan Martin, who is a national political reporter and correspondent for the New York Times. And he covers the midterms very heavily, and he's also looking ahead to the 2020 presidential race. Juleanna Glover, the founder and CEO of Ridgely Walsh, a public affairs consultancy, a longtime Republican advisor to presidents and major Republican officials.
But not a Republican anymore.
But not a Republican anymore. We'll get into that during our discussion here today. Chris LaCivita, a political operative. He was a senior advisor to Senator Rand Paul's 2016 presidential campaign. Chris is also a real veteran of Senate campaigns like the one in 2014 for Pat Roberts in Kansas, and he's a veteran of Virginia politics. Cliff Young is president of Ipsos Public Affairs here in the United States. He also works a lot in national and global affairs, doing polling around the world, studying economic issues, international policy, and how different voters are interacting with those different fronts. And then, of course, Donna Brazile, a veteran Democratic political strategist, a friend of everyone here. She's an author, syndicated columnist, former chair of the Democratic National Committee, and someone who was also campaign manager for Al Gore in 2000. So let's give a warm welcome to our panel here today. Since we only have so much time, we're going to get right into the discussion. I'd ask our panelists to be relatively brief with your answers. We want to make sure that we have a time to get to a lot of topics today. So we'll start with Jonathan. You've been covering the midterms, and you think about the rural and exurban and suburban divide that we've seen in this emerging political map. What should we expect in 2020 based on what you saw this year?
I think these trends are only going to continue. I see no reason why there would be any reversal of kind of this pulling apart. It was striking looking at the maps after Election Day. It almost, in some ways, like defies the candidate, the campaigns, fundraising, incumbency, the nature, all the kind of traditional things that we look towards to explain the results of an election seem to increasingly matter less than the identity of the state or district and their demographics. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes the kind of red places are getting redder, the blue places are getting bluer, and a lot of the purple is getting more blue. And I think that's why Democrats won 40 seats in the House. But you just take two states that we talk a lot about, Michigan and Ohio. And the incumbent senators there won, but they were leading in their polls by double digits, and they won by, roughly 5 or 6 points apiece. And if you look at why that is, well, they won because of massive margins in the cities and suburbs, but even though they were running against little-known challengers, their numbers came down in most of the rural areas in those states from what they had previously posted. I mean, there was a time 10 years ago, not very long ago, where Senate incumbents would win by 30, 40 points in some races. It seems now like a lot of these seats, even where there's a sort of little-known incumbent, they automatically get 40% of the vote. It's really striking to watch, and the reason for that is, to answer your question, is because of this pulling apart of the country's political demography. One last thing, and I'll shut up. There are only 3 House districts left in the country with Republicans that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. There were 23 at the start of the cycle. Tells you a lot.
And thank you. And can everyone make sure they speak into their microphone so everyone here can hear? Donna, listening to Jonathan's remarks, when you look as a Democrat at that map and you think about the presidential race that's about to begin, people heading to Iowa and New Hampshire, who's the best kind of candidate that could seize these different dynamics and really help the party win back the White House? Or what should the party be looking for as they evaluate that field?
First of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. And it's always good to be on GW's campus. Greetings from Georgetown, where I've been for 17 years as an adjunct professor. I want to first say that the gender gap is real, and it's driving a lot of the enthusiasm that you're seeing within the Democratic Party. And as a result of that, I think the Democrats are going to be looking for an outsider, traditionally women are not seen as insiders. And while we have several well-known female candidates who will likely toss their gloves into the ring in 2020, I still believe that an outsider has a better chance of winning the nomination in 2020 versus one of our insiders that we now have in Washington, D.C. And the reason why is because the grassroots, they want a fighter. They want somebody who can tackle some of the big issues like climate change, gun violence. They don't want to listen to a Democrat with what I call Washington, D.C. based talking points where there's a comma in between the sentence and a question mark at the end. So I think what you're going to see in 2020 is a renewed attempt for an outsider to try to come in and to save the day for the Democratic Party. The one last thing, and this is attributed again to the grassroots. What we saw in 2017 and 2018, we saw basically a new generation of candidates who are emerging within the Democratic Party. They're not seeking permission. They're not going to the usual suspect, the PAC, the super donors or the super elite within the party. They're being fueled and empowered by the grassroots. These $5 donations, and by the way, I love $5 donations. That keeps my wallet full because I can get 5 here, 5 there, 10 there, okay? But these $5 donations and the fact that you have millennials engaged, it's going to transform the Democratic Party in 2020. Last point, I know you told me to keep it close, but I'm Catholic. I can't help myself. 2020 is going to be an awesome year because in addition to competing in the traditional 18 states in the District of Columbia that gets us to 246 electoral votes, Democrats, we now have a new terrain in order to play. Yes, we got to continue to battle in Ohio, continue to battle for the 29 electoral votes in Florida, but Arizona, 11 electoral votes. Arizona, Georgia, these states that Democrats have never stepped in a presidential year, at least in the last 20 years, guess what? You'll see a lot of Democrats. Get ready, hot dogs and hamburgers, we're coming.
Donna, real quickly, 2 or 3 names. Who are 2 or 3 outsiders we should keep an eye on?
Well, you know, as a former chair of the party and a member of the DNC, an at-large member, I should keep my mouth shut.
A couple names. You can't tease us, Donna, with outsiders and then not name a couple.
Well, you know, look, there's no question that we have people. We have Mayor Eric Garcetti. We have Beto O'Rourke. I know he's a member of Congress. He lost to Ted Cruz, but there's a Beto factor out there. There's a lot of energy for Tom Steyer, who people believe is energizing and registering new voters, especially millennials. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people that I probably know in my head, but I can't mention now because I'm still talking to a lot of people, we're going to see a lot of people. We're going to have 4 rounds of a debate. So people like Jonathan and Bob will have to really work hard because we have a seniors table. And I'm not just referring to age. We will have an adult, and that's a good table, okay? And then we have the children's table. They're new to politics. We got a mayor in South Bend, Indiana, who's going to run, and I'm excited to see Pete Buttigieg run for president. And then we're going to have the pre-K table. All right. So we got 4 rounds. It's going to be an exciting year to be a Democrat. Get ready for us. Hot dogs, hamburgers, and if you're from Louisiana, a little etouffee and gumbo. We're ready for you.
Thank you, Donna.
Isn't there a mayor of New Orleans, too, who may run?
Mitch Landrieu.
Mitch is still hemming and hawing, but I'm going home for the holidays, so maybe I can twist his arm. After all, we need a little boudin in the race, too.
All right. Juleanna, when you think about the Republican Party, a lot of excitement on the Democratic side, but you've left the Republican Party. You know a lot of the top GOP leaders in the country. With all the news today on Michael Cohen and the Mueller investigation, are Trump critics like yourself thinking about maybe starting a third party, maybe supporting a challenger to President Trump in the 2020 primary, like a Senator Ben Sasse in Nebraska, Ohio Governor John Kasich, maybe even Utah Senator-elect Mitt Romney?
So lots of talk about millennials.
Talk in the mic.
You know, Donna, you mentioned, so let me pull this mic a little bit forward or let me move forward. 81% of millennials believe there should be a third party. About 42% of the electorate, maybe 39% right now identify as independents. 54% of Democrats believe that there should be a third party. Right now, we're dealing with a dichotomy that seems to be off-putting to everybody, but except for if you identify either on the hard left or the hard right. Republican Party seems to be shrinking. Democratic Party seems to be growing.
Juleanna, just
Republican Party seems to be shrinking. The Democratic Party seems to be growing a little bit, but not significantly. What no one's talking about, and I think is vastly misrepresented or unrepresented in the political dynamic, is the interests of people who are in the middle. I'll ask you all. So let's say, who wants to bet on the Democrats coming up with a nominee in 2020 that will win against Trump or the Trump apologist? That seems. Let me ask you this one: Who, if you had a choice coming up in the 2020 election between, say, Trump, Pence, let's do the next most famous Democrat, Bernie Sanders, and somebody like a Kamala, and maybe a up the middle bipartisan ticket of something like a Biden Romney. What would you all pick? Biden Romney? Trump Pence? Or the Democrats? Bernie?
I will go in that direction now. Oh, neither.
We're in Washington. We're in D.C.
Well, it's no, I know. So, but earlier this year I wrote a piece arguing that Republicans should indeed support a third party. It ran in the New York Times. It kind of broke my inbox. Many people who I esteem and lots of people with a lot of resources reached out and said, how do we do this? I think that it's something that we should all consider. I think it's something that if we found the right candidate, the money and the expertise would come to it pretty quickly. So,
but isn't the Republican Party, Juleanna, in the grip of President Trump?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I assume the red states are going to stay with Trump or whoever follows in Trump's footsteps if he does indeed survive this.
Cliff, when you think about the international scene, we hear the term nationalism from President Trump, but we also see it across the world, across Western Europe. So often we think about politics in red versus blue dynamics, in Republican versus Democrat. What about nationalism as a new theme that's changing our politics as we look to 2020?
Well, I'm the data dude, so I have my stack of data right here, but I won't look at it for now. I just want to say I absolutely agree with Donna. That's my opening statement. Absolutely. I think we're in the age of the outsider, and I would even make the argument that we probably shouldn't overemphasize the word nationalism. I'll come back to that. What we have to understand, both in the United States and globally, especially in the West, is that there's a rise of anti-establishmentism, I think I just invented that word, of outsider the candidates that are willing to shake the system. Indeed, if you look at polling, whether it be in the United States or Europe or Latin America, the West principally, there is supermajority belief that the system is broken, that the establishment is not delivering on the basic promises, that traditional parties and politicians no longer care about the average person like me, for instance, and linked to that is a belief that to take the country back, to take society back, well, that sounds very familiar, right? By the way, it's not just happening in the U.S. That's not the rhetoric just in the U.S. To take the country back, we need a strong leader who might need to break the rules to take the country back. This is a phenomenon we're seeing everywhere. Obviously, it takes on different flavors in different places. Here in the United States, we had a right-leaning populist that came to power on that message, on that outsider message. But let me just kind of present this to you specifically, because many of us were perplexed, obviously, especially in 2015, about Trump. But I think Bernie Sanders was interesting as well. And indeed, if you really think about it, they're two sides of the same coin. Indeed, they were both outsider candidates. They operationalize the disgust and anger in different ways. The left typically has much more economic equality argument. And the right, it's much more cultural in nature, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. The point being is these trends, these sort of attitudes and belief have created an operating environment that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So I would expect that the candidate on the left, in this case the United States, the Democrats, the candidate has more of an outsider profile, maybe an insider-outsider, a little bit more vanilla, not as sort of problematic and spicy. I use the example of France, of Macron and Le Pen. They were both outsider candidates, by the way. One was a little bit more vanilla. The other one was, it really hurt and burned when you actually swallowed a little bit of it. But the point being is, in both cases, they were outsider candidates, and I would expect the most likely candidate to have a chance on the left, that is with Democrats, will have some sort of outsider profile.
Chris, you've worked a lot with Senate campaigns and the Republican Party. As you look to the U.S. Senate being a real galvanizing force for Republican voters this year with the Supreme Court and the federal court, are we going to see that again in 2020, or are there too many distractions with the new Congress, investigations on President Trump, House Democrats maybe trying to cut deals with the president on infrastructure, or does the U.S. Senate remain that same big factor for 2020?
Well, first of all, I think it should be obviously we picked up, there was, Republicans actually had a net gain in seats in the United States Senate. And obviously the whole issue of the Supreme Court played into that. I mean, if you look at what happened in Indiana, North Dakota, obviously their votes against Kavanaugh had an impact overall. But, next cycle going into 2020, the Senate seats, so, we have 34 seats that are up for election. 22 are held by the GOP, 12 are held by the Dems. And I guess you could say and I look at it just looking at it from a tactical standpoint, what are those races really that are going to be in play? Potentially North Carolina, Tom Tillis, that's an R+5 district, state. Arizona is going to be open, probably a very good opportunity for Democrats to pick up, which would have obviously an impact in the presidential race. Joni Ernst in Iowa is another race that Republicans will have to play defense on, and as well Susan Collins and Gardner, Cory Gardner in Colorado. But at the same time, we have an opportunity to pick up a seat in Alabama in a presidential race. So, look, from the standpoint of looking at the House map and looking at the Senate map, you've got to be able to actually accomplish something. And there are some key issues that the president has made clear that he wants to get done. One of the first things right after he was elected said he wants to repeal and replace Obamacare. What ends up happening? The Republicans were in a prime position to do that, and they didn't. And I think that to a certain extent they paid a price for that in the ballot box in some districts. And I think that the continued stymieing on the wall, you go debate the merits of it. But at the end of the day, that's going to have an impact on Republican enthusiasm. And so we've got to be able to accomplish certain things. I think the infrastructure bill is going to be very important because that's so local, right? I mean, and so these things are all going to come into play. But, but at the same time, listening to what everyone was saying about the slew of candidates that are going to be running in 2020 on the Democrat side, let's not forget Tom Steyer and Bloomberg's money. That's going to have an impact. We don't know how much of an impact or in what way. I don't think the Democrats really know. I don't think we can really say who is the Democrat base going to go for. I would agree that they're going to follow the Republicans' lead and go with an outsider. But the money factor is obviously going to play, and then the fact that you all changed the rules to a certain extent with superdelegates and the role that they play. That's going to shift and change the party process. So, it's going to be a fascinating year. That's for certain.
We've mentioned a lot of outsiders.
Yeah.
Jonathan, you spent a lot of time reporting on the insiders during the shadow campaign, the front runners in many polls, Vice President Biden, Senator Warren. Where do they fit in this mix?
It's not clear. I'm curious what Donna thinks about this. I believe that this is the most wide-open Democratic and uncertain Democratic primary since at least 2004 and maybe since 92, where going in, there's no obvious front runner, where a pair of the most formidable candidates may not even run, i.e. Sanders and Biden, and still up in the air what's going to happen. So I think there's great uncertainty about the contours of the race. I do, though, think that Washington credentials and experience will have about as much appeal as they did in 2016 for the Republicans. And that's a sort of trend that's bigger than both parties. This is not a terribly original insight, but we have basically at least 4 parties jammed into the architecture of 2 parties. And it just it shows. We're not Europe. We have a two-party system, and it is increasingly ungainly. You've got a Bernie Sanders sort of leftist party. You've got a more Clinton, Obama-style center-left party. You've got a kind of Bushian establishment center-right party. And you've got a more Trump nationalist party. But they're all sort of jammed into two parties. And I think that creates some real tensions. You saw that with the Republicans in 2016. Certainly, and I think you're going to see it now more with the Democrats, where their coalition includes everything from, true blue socialist to kind of country club suburbanites who are basically Republicans on fiscal issues, but think that Trump is utterly repellent in terms of his conduct, and so they've left the party. That's a pretty big coalition from socialists to the kind of, Chevy Chase, Greenwich crowd. To absorb. And so how does that play out in the primary? I think it's going to be fascinating to sort of watch unfold. And I will borrow a great Dr. Larry J. Sabato dictum, which is he who lives by the crystal ball winds up eating glass. So I will not gaze into the crystal ball about the 2020 Democratic primary, except to say that uncertainty is certainly the order of the day. And I do think that they will tend towards more of an outsider.
You still should read Larry's Crystal Ball newsletter. It's terrific. Don't worry, you're not going to eat glass. Donna, are we looking at a contested convention for the Democrats if we have these four tables from the seniors to the pre-K?
Well,
and will the party be able to handle that with the rules? We saw what happened in 2016.
First of all, I think the party can handle it at the end of the day, but unfortunately, many of us are going to be in a position where, let's just say, we might not want to show up for work. We have, as you all know, the four early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. They will likely be scheduled in the month of February. And then in March, we have this huge crowded field of states positioning themselves to become, of course, the arbiter of the primary. California moving up to March is going to create a massive traffic jam for obvious reasons. We have likely maybe two, perhaps three candidates who will hail from California. And if they sort of, split the vote, we might not know the outcome for California for at least 2 or 3 weeks because of the way they count votes in California. It takes a long time. They should go down to Louisiana. We'll count them overnight, and before you vote, we'll know the results. That being said, with Super Duper Tuesday perhaps being a huge event, we won't know. Yeah. 4 or 5 candidates will emerge, during the month of March, and then we'll go into April with big states like Pennsylvania, New York. And again, with proportional rules, that will bring us into May with a smaller but significant number of states, and then June, where you have 3 or 4 states, and here come our convention. So we might get to the convention, and the superdelegates, the people who are now outside the box, the superdelegates will have to come back into the box and ultimately decide who the nominee is. I do not like to be placed in that position. I wanted and I argued that the superdelegates are the automatic delegates. I'm an automatic delegate, and please do not tell me I am not relevant. I am very relevant. But as an automatic delegate, I would like to be part of the sauce and not wait until the voters decide, and then I got to go in and perhaps make the decision that the voters don't want. So we're looking at a wide open contest. I think you're right. I think it's more like 92 than 04, because by 04, we understood that it was about the war and about the economy. And, Barack Obama emerged after the convention in 04 to be...
No, 08.
No, he emerged after 04 in the convention.
Yes, right.
It was Kerry because we were still dealing with the immediate impact of 9/11 and there was this entrenched feeling that it could happen again. And we assume that women voters and others, those who tend to wait until the last moment to make up their minds, we assume that they wanted someone with Kerry's background and John Kerry's status. And by the way, John Kerry is now thinking about it.
I saw that.
I'm telling you, we need to have a drinking contest on the Democratic side.
Back to the future.
Back to the future. But like I said, we have a seniors table, so there's a role for John Kerry. Everybody.
I've got an oppo packet on John Kerry if anybody wants to see it.
Okay, baby. No more Swift boat, and I'm sitting next to you.
For those close consumers of politics out there, they'll appreciate it.
Yeah. But be careful who you're sitting by, because you couldn't Swift boat me, because I understand what's in the water. So yeah, at the end of the day, to your question, we're going to have a long, drawn-out process.
Thank you.
And I do believe that at the end of the day, we might go to the committee. It won't be contested. We'll probably know there will be a front runner, somebody with perhaps 30 more delegates. Ultimately, we may wait until we get to the convention. And by the way, I don't even know what a convention is going to be, because there's 3 cities that are still competing, Milwaukee, Miami, and Houston. And yes, I have a preference. But we'll see what happens.
What's your preference?
Houston.
Houston.
Yeah.
Close to home.
It's 5 hours from New Orleans.
Fair enough.
Should be in New Orleans.
Juleanna, when you think about your career, you've worked for some of the leading foreign policy Republican hawks of our time, Senator McCain, President Bush, Vice President Cheney. Where does foreign policy fit as we look at the political road ahead? President Trump has not really been an interventionist, but he's caused some Republicans to be alarmed by his handling of North Korea. Others have cheered him, and issues like Syria.
I think most foreign policy right now is focused on what's going on with Russia, particularly today. In terms of sort of where Trump has led on foreign policy, it's been sort of visceral, reactive, definitely something where he feels like he can make the best deal at any point in time than any other human that may or may not have ever existed. Corker, has tried to moderate from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and sort of offer some voices and criticism around Trump, but, Trump owns the mic on foreign policy. I don't really see any room for anybody to necessarily challenge him on that. And even in terms of he did have a Republican challenger in the primary process, I guess maybe only Kasich would be someone who would do that, and he's not someone who's particularly well credentialed in foreign policy. So,
Cliff, any thoughts on, as you look at the polling at your firm, about where we see voters going, especially in the suburban areas Jonathan was talking about?
Well, definitely. First and foremost, I know we had the first panel, we talked about the midterms. And I know Kyle brought up the point about the relationship between midterms and general elections. I have a data point right here, but you won't see it, but I promise you it's here. That if you take all the elections since 1948 and you plot the midterms against the generals, there's no correlation. So it's not predictive. That doesn't mean it's not suggestive, but it's not necessarily predictive. Yes, indeed, I would say, and I'll come back and talk a bit about Trump, where he stands in a historical sense in terms of averages. By the way, I love averages. That might have been the most important human invention ever. It orients us. It gives us a reference point. But I think, obviously suburbia is a problem. I think the midterms showed that. That's the kink in his armor that makes it difficult, the math more difficult. Obviously, he won by a razor-thin margin in a few states. And I think that's a glimmer of hope for Democrats on the one hand, and storm clouds on the horizon. I don't know how many, but there's storm clouds on the horizon for the Republicans. But just stepping back a bit, we handicap elections. I handicap elections all over the world for private sector clients. We have this massive database. Once again, I'm the data dude. And what do we know? What are some things we know? Well, we know that incumbents have a threefold advantage over non-incumbents. Incumbency, I wouldn't say necessarily is king or queen, but incumbency is super important. The other thing is, independent of that, the most important predictor of electoral outcomes are approval ratings, right? And when you combine approval ratings with incumbency, it's an interesting mix. So what do we know? If Trump is like the average, and we can debate that, whether he's above the average, below the average, or not, what we do know, a sitting president between 38 and 40 points has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the election. He's at 42, 43. You take the Gallup. I think the Gallup's a little bit of an outlier at 38. But he's still in the range where he has a significant non-zero chance of winning. He has a good chance, not necessarily an absolute chance. And so we can't discount them. Indeed, obviously the midterms creates a degree of delusion. As I was saying that apples are apples and bananas are bananas, and midterms aren't necessarily predictive of elections. They might be suggestive. But if he were just an average performer, he's in a pretty good place, if not dominant place, going into 2020. The question is, should we discount him a bit? And I think probably that could be a dynamic of this debate here, this discussion here. Is he an average performer, below average performer? There's a lot of arguments for and against, probably more against than for, but I'll leave it at that.
Chris, when you think about Virginia, you've worked for Ken Cuccinelli. You've worked for George Allen. You've been on so many campaigns in Virginia. And Virginia has at times been seen as a swing state, but they've really had to deal with the issue of race in recent years. Corey Stewart running for U.S. Senate against Democrat Tim Kaine dealt with that issue in the Confederate statues, the tragedy in Charlottesville in 2017. How do Republicans in Virginia and Republicans nationally confront the issue of race moving forward?
Well, you know, I think just Corey Stewart, just an aberration in the Commonwealth. Matter of fact, it was strange. I actually had write-in votes for the U.S. Senate in my home county. I don't know how that happened, but the registrar called me and let me know. I was like, oh, that's nice. You know, it's, I mean, obviously it's a very important issue that you know, what happened in Charlottesville, obviously, you know, inflaming, I think the positions that, what made that, I guess for we were smack dab in the middle of a gubernatorial primary, and Republican primary, and we had a candidate who at the time was desperate for, looking for attention, running against the establishment pick, right, which was Ed Gillespie, and basically latching on to any type of controversy that could feed him name ID because he didn't have money to run, so he latched onto that and used it. And he had a lot of assistance from you know, obviously from the press corps that, you know, would follow up on anything that he said. So, I mean, and I really think that's much more of an aberration. In terms of Virginia, obviously has become very much a swing state. I've done so many races in the Commonwealth. There are parts of the Commonwealth that I don't recognize from back in the early 90s, you know, when to win a race in Virginia, it used to be minimize your losses in Northern Virginia, rack up margins in the Richmond suburbs and the Valley, Southwest and South Side, and break even in Virginia Beach. Well, that formula doesn't work anymore. And obviously, you know, in 2008 with President Obama on the ticket, really changed, I think, quite a bit. You know, you had a census plus African-American turnout, which means that for the Republican to win, he needed to get somewhere in the neighborhood of 64, 63% of the decided white vote. That's a very difficult formula to receive. So, and in past elections, guys like George Allen, you know, he used to get 20, 22% of the African-American vote. But obviously that's changed as things have become a lot more polarized, unfortunately. But look, you know, Republicans have to be very strong and very forceful and very quick in condemning any type of activity that could be construed, you know, as intolerant. I mean, they just need to be. But again, at the end of the day, but at the same time, I think we from both sides need to look at it as because both sides do things to inflame divisions in order to maximize base turnout. I mean, I remember in 2004, or actually in 2000, I was managing George Allen's U.S. Senate race against Chuck Robb in the Commonwealth of Virginia when a mailer showed up from I can't remember who, somebody that had you know, chains on the back of a pickup truck and was basically saying that George Bush was for dragging an African-American guy through the streets of Texas. So, and that was pretty inflamed and pretty nasty. So, you know, hopefully at some point in time people get away from those types of inflamed, that kind of inflamed rhetoric and tactic. But at the end of the day, you know, I think Corey Stewart will probably move back to Minnesota, which would be nice. The Republicans can focus on the future, at least in the Commonwealth.
Juleanna, any thoughts on either race, or you look at the House GOP right now, a scarcity of women in the U.S. House? I know you're not a Republican anymore, but you know the party.
Do know the party very, very well.
So what do you make of the Republican challenges both on gender and race?
I mean, I think we reap what we sow. I mean, the Republican Party has not been particularly good in the last couple of years in standing up when they've seen any type of racial discrimination issues. And of course, Trump's activity around the pro-life movement has decreased support among women in the suburbs. So, it's not really a lot to observe there other than the facts as they exist. And he's not done much to make himself appealing. I mean, to either minorities or to women in the suburbs in particular.
Cliff, I want to use you to bounce into a question for Jonathan and Donna. When you look at the Democratic Party, there's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, newly elected representative from New York, defines herself as a Democratic socialist. So does Senator Sanders from Vermont. When you're talking to Democratic voters in your surveys, how do they describe themselves? Is this Democratic socialism on the rise on the left and within the Democratic Party?
Yeah, the first sort of response is, I don't know. I actually don't know. That's a great question. What we do know is the sort of, and I'd step back from labels, the rhetoric that she uses, the belief system that she emphasizes resonates with her base. Right, and I completely agree with the comment here that we have 4 different parties, one of which is a far left-leaning, kind of socially oriented, economic equality, economic justice, social justice oriented party, and that's sort of the rhetoric that she uses. If you were just to pinch what she says, maybe not the label specifically, but the sort of rhetoric that she uses, without a doubt resonates with that sort of base. The size of it, nationally speaking, maybe 15 to 20% or so. It's not insignificant. By the way, on the other side, we're talking probably about 15% of the population are strong nativists. If you look at, if I were to project long term, I mean, we obviously have a population that's changing demographically, and it's significantly so. Indeed, that is one of the trends, going from a primary majority white country to one that isn't. That's one of the key trends that's driving and creating our new world. And her sort of diversity-oriented rhetoric is increasingly going to resonate with a larger portion of the population. Indeed, if you look specifically, kind of looking forward in terms of generational replacement, millennials have much more of that sort of rhetoric, that sort of orientation toward that sort of rhetoric than older generations. And Don and I were talking before in the green room. I always use the term kind of to explain it. It's from my grandmother, who was an activist, and she always said, there's nothing that a good Christian burial can't resolve. And so you have old people dying and leaving the population, new ones coming in with different sort of value sets. Indeed, that sort of rhetoric, that belief system that encompasses that, a democratic socialist, is on the rise, but it's the slow march of history.
Jonathan, when you look at the 2020 Democratic field, if that democratic socialism energy is there, where does someone like Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio fit? He was able to win in a state in 2018 that Republicans were able to win the gubernatorial race. President Trump's voters still came out in that state, but he found a way, maybe running on trade, to survive. Are the Democrats recognizing the tension between the Sherrod Browns of the party and the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes?
I mean, the question to me is, will 2020 be more like the 2016 Democratic primary or the 2008 Democratic primary? And what I mean by that is, will it be a kind of ideological litmus test, or will it be a more complex question of generation and persona and charisma and inspiration? People forget this, but Barack Obama was not the most liberal candidate in the Democratic field in 2008. John Edwards ran to the left. Don't forget John Edwards, folks, who coined that great phrase, the two Americas. Hillary Clinton, in many ways, was more of a progressive than Obama, certainly on health care. In fact, he attacked her for having a mandate in her health care plan. So it's not clear to me what this is going to be, and Democratic primaries aren't always, the center left versus the left. And I'm not convinced that it's going to be this time either. And you just, look no further than Beto O'Rourke, who, while certainly staked out progressive stances in Texas, was not somebody who kind of ran an ideological campaign. He ran more of an Obama-style campaign that's more about uplift and unity and a sort of better kind of politics than it was about, here's my white paper on these 5 issues. So I think we just don't know if this is an 08 primary or more of a 16 primary. But even in 16, I would posit that, well, certainly Bernie was able to sort of galvanize a lot of folks on the left because of his ideological stances. It wasn't just that. I mean, a lot of the Bernie support was more of an anti-Hillary sort of rallying effect because they wanted to turn the page on the Clintons. Yes, ideologically in some ways, but not just ideologically.
A final thing to Donna, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. Donna, when Jonathan mentioned Congressman O'Rourke from Texas, his Senate campaign, you look at Stacey Abrams running in Georgia, Andrew Gillum in Florida, disappointments for the Democrats, but they came close. Beto O'Rourke, a disappointment, came close. What's it going to take for the Democrats? They just lost in Mississippi this week, but again came close with Mike Espy, to win in the South, your home, or to come back in a place like Texas and Georgia or Florida and go over the edge?
It's funny. You were reading my notes because I put Gillum's Abrams. It's coming. Geography, demography, the energy, the millennials, the numbers are there. What Stacey and Andrew did was to expand the electorate, to empower a new generation to take their seats at the table. It's amazing that while they lost, we were able to still pick up seats. Lucy McBeth is now representing Georgia 6. That's a huge achievement. And she ran on, healthcare and gun violence, dealing with those 2 issues. And Florida, I mean, Andrew lost, but still we were able to pick up Florida 26, Florida 27. We picked up seats. And if you look at the state legislative seats where we've been losing over the last 8 years, Democrats flipped 8 seats and took away 2 Republican supermajority. Once again, the future of the Democratic Party lies with not only embracing millennials and some of the issues that they care about, but also allowing this new generation of candidates to take their seats at the table. If we're able to harvest this energy and to turn this electoral energy into advancing the Democratic agenda, we will succeed. Last thing, when I was a kid growing up in the South, we always thought that, well, with a good black vote, all we needed was perhaps 35 to 40% of the white vote. We didn't have to get more than 35, 40% of the white vote. Well, today with a good black vote, we only need 30% of the white vote. And we've seen evidence of that in Virginia, where Justin Fairfax won. And, of course, we've seen evidence in other places in the South. But, honestly, we've seen that evidence with Republicans. Right. And with Doug Wilder. With Doug Wilder. But so my point is that if we're ever going to achieve parity for women, because women are still underrepresented in politics, although we've made significant advances in this last cycle, we need both Republicans as well as Democrats running. We need Republicans to pick up the baton and encourage women to get in the pipeline, because you cannot do it with Democrats alone. And the same is true with African Americans and other minorities. We need both parties to engage these communities in order to empower them to seek public office. That's the only way we're going to have true representation of the great diversity of our country, which is a strength. It's a strength to have the diversity of our country represented at the table.
Before we get to questions, if people could line up, that'd be great. I just want to thank Larry Sabato, who's been a friend and a wonderful politics.
Thank you, Larry.
He and his team at the Center of Politics are a class operation, and I really appreciate, as a reporter, all the work they do to provide nonpartisan analysis, the whole UVA team, and really thank you to GW for hosting this 20th Annual American Democracy Conference.
The undefeated UVA Cavaliers.
That's right.
Yes.
By the way.
Now, to the audience members,
Which team?
please limit your question to 1 sentence and make it a question. I'm serious. I've watched the rest of this conference. With all respect the audience's time and the panel's time. Ask a 1-sentence question and then step away. Thank you.
Swift votes.
All right. My question, in the backdrop of third-party yearning, second choice balloting, Yankee aberration or wave of the future?
Ranked choice, you mean?
Juleanna, you want to take it?
I mean, I think ranked choice is an incredibly intriguing proposition. I think In Virginia, and, Chris, I'd be curious what you thought about this, because obviously Virginia ended up with a very weak senatorial candidate, but if there had been ranked choice voting in Virginia, there wouldn't have been a Corey Stewart candidacy.
Right.
I think that the time's right for a lot of innovations in the political space. It's been pretty stagnant for a long time. And it seems to me that there's very much an appetite to see, different types of change that could include structural changes as well as new candidates.
And the question was about ranked choice. Chris, you have any points on that?
Well, I mean, I lost the governor's race in 2013 in Virginia by 1.6 points, 1.6 percentage points, and the independent was a libertarian who received over 4.5 points. So, they have an impact. Generally, it's not one, I think, in a state like Virginia that favors the Republicans. But I mean, look, you can talk about third parties. I quite frankly am a big two-party guy, but at the same time, I think the biggest problem with the biggest threat to the two-party system in this country was McCain-Feingold, because basically it took the money out of the parties and threw it to basically anyone with money to actually impact the outcome of, be it a primary or a general election. I mean, it's a personal opinion of mine, but I ran the Senate committee, was political director in 2002 with Bill Frist when we had soft money, that awful soft money. And so, I've seen the difference in the political committees in Washington become less and less of a factor. I think the established political committees become less and less a factor, and then you have the whether that be the Kochs or the Steyers of the world who actually have a direct impact in electoral politics. And then, of course, you have the advent of, 501c4s, which basically raise boatloads of money that no one knows where the donors are coming from. And, so.
Great, thank you.
Just another point.
Another brief question.
Yeah. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. My question is diversity is not good enough. We have to have fairness and justice. Everybody have an equal opportunity to express their capability, and government should have a responsibility to allow them to speak and campaign. Fairness is not small donor campaign, but fairness. And so maintain the website or debate for every candidate.
Donna, how do we look at that?
Not two parties.
Thank you so much. Donna, how do we look at access? You focus on voter suppression at the DNC. How are the Democrats looking at those kind of issues, access to our democracy?
Well, I think the party has been quite fair in allowing everyone to have a seat at the table, especially candidates. At least in my experience of being not only a vice chair but the interim chair twice in the Democratic Party, is that our rules allow outsiders to come in and to run on our ticket. So I think we have allowed that. In terms of the debates for 2020, someone else is going to have to make that decision. I'm out of the debate business. Hello. Everybody know that if I'm in the debate business, I'm going to tell you what we're going to debate, and therefore you will get a question about what we're going to debate. But I'm out of the debate business. But I do believe in 2020, we're going to have to ensure that all of the candidates get ample opportunity to be in those public forums. But I also encourage candidates, don't wait for the media and wait for the party to decide when we're going to open up the debate process. Go out there now. Go out there and meet the candidates. Go out there and be the third or fourth person in these town hall meetings that get a chance to introduce themselves. So I would encourage people to get out there early and to go to those states right now, plant seeds, and start talking to the activists. That's the way they get heard.
Also, as part of that, I would add that in terms of diversity, Republican efforts to suppress voter turnout have been one of the most outrageous and off-putting activities that I've witnessed as a participant in the political process. It's one of the reasons why I'm not a Republican anymore, is sort of this years of watching Republicans continue to try and keep people from voting.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I have a question. Considering that the punditry class didn't see the last two presidents being elected, that I want you to consider what are the possibilities of a, for example, very credible Jill Stein type candidate running and destroying, for example, progressives in the Democratic Party, or the very real possibility that Donald Trump doesn't run?
Jonathan?
I think Trump not running is possible depending upon the circumstances of his, legal exposure and the exposure.
So euphemistic.
The exposure of his family and associates. And I think on the left, I agree. Look, I think in a really fractured Democratic field with proportional primaries and conventions and a campaign that could go to the convention, I wouldn't rule anything out in terms of who could be the nominee. And you raised a good point. I think the rise of President Trump does suggest that people should not believe that the most hard to believe possibility won't come true. There's a great quote from Arthur Schlesinger, said the future outwits all of our certitudes. And I think that we certainly saw that in the case of President Obama. And I also, just real fast, I got into a back and forth with an Obama person the other day about this who is very fond of Beto O'Rourke. Look, I think Obama 08 and it just sort of proves that you've got to run when the moment is there. Mm-hmm. And you can't wait, and you can't sort of try and game this thing out. Chris Christie ran in 2016, probably should have run in 2012, right? Right. Senator Warren, who is probably going to run this time around, there was an opening for her that Bernie failed in 2016. And I think the lesson of all this is you can't game this stuff out. You run when the moment presents itself, because the voters increasingly aren't going to judge you on how many, do you have X years of experience. Right. They're going to judge you on the moment and the sort of ripening of the candidacy.
Yeah, just to add, just to add to this point, my initial point was we're in this sort of age of the outsider. And maybe you would expect outsiders coming from every direction, right? But systems, institutions, orders matter for political outcomes. Public opinion is essential, obviously, but systems, institutions, orders are important. And we have to remember that Donald Trump did not run as a third-party or alternative candidate, but he basically committed a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. So yes, there's always a possibility of an outsider candidate gaining steam on the outside of the system. I think the probabilities are very low, but it could happen. If the probabilities perhaps are higher for there to be a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party than some sort of outsider coming through sort of a third-party way.
Sir.
First of all, hold on. Too tall. Jonathan, when you mentioned an Obama official that was pro-Beto, I feel like that's Dan Pfeiffer, and you're just not mentioning it. But my question is, do you think Obama campaigning for Gillum in Florida and in a few other races, and some they lost, was a hindrance? And do you think he would be best served to be campaigning for the 2020 candidate when they come out of the primary?
I'll give you a short answer. I don't think it had much impact, adverse impact on Gillum. I think that was not Gillum's challenge. I think much more complicated than who the surrogate was for like 1 day of campaigning.
Probably would have been even worse had he not shown up, because then the question would have been, why isn't he here?
Right, and he was in South Florida,
right.
And frankly, that was one of the big problems Gillum had, was that turnout in Miami-Dade was abysmal, one of the worst in the state. So if anything, Obama probably brought out a few voters.
Midterm elections are about turning out your base,
right?
Bottom line.
Obama was very helpful to Democratic candidates across the country, and I was pleased to see not only the president, but Mrs. Obama, who did a fantastic job encouraging people to register and vote. They were an asset to the Democratic Party.
Thank you, sir. We'll take these final two.
Okay. My question is about the involvement of the news media in the midterms, especially through these stories such as the caravan situation, where we see these, I've heard them being called October surprises, where it's basically a story that is brought up right before the midterm and then it's pretty much dropped, and whether or not is actually a real threat to the country or just to society is debatable. So we saw this with we're seeing this with the caravan, where it was a really big thing on the conservative media like Fox News, and even today, like weeks after the midterm, it's still 5 weeks away. It's not, you can debate whether or not it's really a problem, but it's not relevant at this moment, and it wasn't relevant during the midterms. And then we saw this in 2014 with the Ebola crisis, where it was another excuse for conservative candidates to talk about borders and immigration and stuff like that. And then following the midterm, it was pretty much dropped, and no one's talked about it anymore. So just like, what do you think about
Cliff, on the effect of the caravan and the way that it handles these sort of
Yeah, I
issues?
mean, I'll set aside sort of the role of the media and their relative responsibility in respect to this issue, and just go back to the initial point of, understanding that across the board there's a belief that the society's broken across partisan lines, but it's operationalized differently. On the Republican side, on the right, it's operationalized much more in a visceral way. It's much less deductive, and it's extremely linked to nativism, immigration, and white grievance. Actually, those are the two key drivers. Like, I rarely look at demographics. I know it's easier to slice and dice by demographics. I look at attitudes. And what you're seeing there is a very deliberate attempt or program to create proof points to do what I call emotional pump priming. And so what you're doing is you're activating people at a cognitive level in a visceral way. We call psychologists and behavioral economists, we call it hot cognition, or inducing biased cognitive reasoning. And in my mind, above and beyond the issue of declining trust and the belief that the system is broken, it perhaps is our biggest challenge today, because it creates problems of governance and creating consensus. But more specifically, the caravan was a deliberate attempt. It was a proof point that allowed one side to really emotionally pump prime.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is directed to Ms. Brazile. I saw you a couple of years ago back in San Francisco. I like you, and you're direct and you're to the point. However, I completely disagree with you on some subjects. Case in point, I want to speak with you in regards to, say, for example, the walkaway movement or other movements that are leaving the Democratic Party because they feel that they are not represented anymore. And I just wanted my question to you is, how do you combat that? And say for also, when people look at you and they see that you're a person of color, they automatically think that you're going to vote Democrat. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. So my question to you is, whatever happened to the Democratic Party from JFK?
Well, thank you. And by the way, I sometimes disagree with myself.
I like the gumbo, though.
Oh, girl, I make the best gumbo. You know, the Democratic Party has evolved over the last 50 years. It has completely, I think, stripped itself of a Dixiecrat past. It is now a more center-left party. It is still evolving. There's no question that for years it was seen as a party of not only economic reforms but social justice. And I think the 21st century Democratic Party is going to come more and more into view as a party that not only speaks on behalf of, but try to stand up for the working class, a party that believes that prosperity should be shared by all, and a party that believes in diversity and inclusion at all levels. So it is a party that has come out of the wilderness. It's been in the wilderness. You see now more Democratic governors than we had, say, a year ago, 2 years ago. You see a more diverse party with diverse candidates. We have the largest group of diverse freshmen that will serve in the House of Representatives. So it is a stronger party because of the diversity, but a stronger party because I think we're becoming very clear about our focus and our challenges in the 21st century. And by the way, I started at the age of 9. I got involved in the Democratic Party when Dr. King was assassinated. And although I was not eligible to vote, I still went out there door to door because the candidate I worked for believed that we could get a playground in my neighborhood. I'm still a Democrat because I believe that this party represents our values and the value system that my parents and my grandparents and others believed in as Americans. And I am a fifth-generation American. We trace our roots to the Jamestown Society. So next year we celebrate our 400th anniversary in this great country. And as a Democrat, I'm proud to be an American, but I'm also proud to be a champion for inclusion and justice and equality for all. And thank you for speaking to me again. And if you ever have my gumbo, we'll never get into a disagreement.
After hearing that, Donna, after hearing that answer, I wonder if we should add Donna Brazile to the 2020 list of possible candidates. But anyway, I wanted to, we're going to close up the conference right now, but please welcome back Larry Sabato.
Well done.
As we expected, they did a terrific job. We learned a lot. We want some of the gumbo. I want it to be vegetarian, at least my portion of it, okay? Because that's the way I am. But thank you all for the great job that you did. Bob, we knew, I don't know how we knew, but we thought you'd be a good host of a panel like this. People tell me you've had experience. Nonetheless, I wanted you to know we are permanently adopting your one-sentence rule, and we're calling it the Bob Costa rule of questions. There will be no payment. It's just the honor of having your name attached to this permanent rule. But thank you all very, very much. Thank you for coming and joining us for our 20th anniversary. And we'll be back again next year if the creeks don't rise. And what's the other part of that? If the something about the creeks don't rise and the something, something, something. Virginia's not Southern anymore. So, you know, we don't remember phrases like that. But thank you all very much. Take care.
Thanks, Juleanna. Take care.